Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Davarian Baldwin. Let's go. So I actually just went to his last talk, or he had a discussion with the chair of the Regents, John Perez, and it was kind of hilarious. Just watching the Regents struggle to come up with answers, like to respond to all of the genuine criticisms of UC Berkeley's housing plans. So yeah, so thank you for being here, Dr. Baldwin. Let me spotlight you. And then do you want to share your own slides?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be great. Thank you.
Cool.
Hear me?
Let me just add you as co-host.
Thank you. So while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you so much to June and Amanda for making it possible for me to be here. I was actually out in Berkeley just 2 weeks ago, as was just pointed out. I learned a lot. I had seen things virtually, but being able to be on the ground, it made a huge difference. So I really thank y'all for the opportunity to speak with you in more detail about what I found, what I've seen across the country, and how I feel that UC Berkeley is a patent example of what I call universe cities. So are we ready? We good to go?
Yeah, we're all set up. You're good.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start and share my screen, and we can go from there. So 1 second, sorry. So the way I want to frame my remarks to you all this afternoon, evening, is by this notion of when your public university becomes a private developer. As I just pointed out, when there was a huge battle over the last couple of years around the future of People's Park, and the university has been able to make a savvy argument around the claim that, well, adding more housing is a way to increase student enrollment, is a way to make accessible elite, high-level higher education, especially to the underserved, and particularly the Black and Brown and the working poor communities in the state of California. And so any critique, any resistance of building housing, even in People's Park, is therefore a fight or an attack on democratizing higher education. Now, it's hard to battle with that because you say, well, who's against higher education? Who's against making higher education more accessible? Who's against making higher education accessible to Black and Brown folk living in the Bay Area and in the state of California? So to say that if you are against housing in People's Park, you are against increasing higher education, you come off looking very wrong, very negative, because it argues that you are against the public good, because the public good here is the growth of UC Berkeley's campus. But as I walked around, here's some pictures when I was there. As I walked around People's Park, I was made aware of a whole different public and their public good. I learned about and saw with my own eyes the number of unhoused residents and some students who find their way to live, even temporarily, in People's Park. I saw the theater stage where young people and elders are able to create art, are able to take education classes, art classes, are able to convene to learn about public services, social services, are able to find a refuge in the face of the encroaching power of Cal Berkeley's police department. And so they are also the public. And so it became very clear to me is that to what degree is the University of California, Berkeley, using this language of the public to in fact undermine and extract resources and opportunities from this other public, those residents who are hosting this California university system in their midst. So this story, this struggle over the future of People's Park, and this contestation over two competing notions of the public made very clear to me the degree to which the story of UC Berkeley and this town of Berkeley and their relationship is a prototypical example of what I call the struggle over universe cities. that in the inability for residents in the town to make claims for the protection of their own public good, because it was being trumped by the public good of higher education for the state, we see the limited recourse that residents have when trying to hold public universities accountable to their host communities. Consistent with national trends, California only finances about 13% of UC Berkeley's operating budget. In the name of serving the public, the university has in turn turned to increased enrollments and profitable land deals to grow their wealth. But such approaches raise costs for students and draw on the resources and raise the housing costs for the host city of Berkeley. So when we look at a term like public good, we must ask, who is the public here? Should the public, i.e. Berkeley residents, be forced to make inordinate sacrifices to serve the state of California's interests in public higher education? Furthermore, should low-income students that get into Berkeley but can't afford to live in the limited housing on the campus or nearby, should they sacrifice for the elite and wealthy students that can full pay their tuition and elite affluent housing on the campus or nearby? Is that the arrangement that we should be asking for in terms of serving the public good? This is the question that reached to me, that struck me when talking about, well, what public good for who? Well, Berkeley is not unique in this crossroads about both the benefits and the costs of higher education institutions for our public, however one defines it. And the controversy in Berkeley is part of a much bigger story, a story to which now I want to turn. I want to situate this story around People's Park within a larger conversation around what happens when your university becomes an urban developer. What are the benefits and what are the costs, and for whom? First of all, right before our eyes, it's colleges and universities that have become the biggest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities and college towns all across the country. With this, colleges and universities, let's be clear, they bring ideas and people together. I remember being in school, seeing people that I never would have seen in my own small town, reading things I never would have read in my small library. So we have to acknowledge what universities can do. And they also have the capacity to generate new innovations in their laboratories, in their classrooms, on their extended campuses. But with such importance, we have also seen higher education's growing control over the economic development and governance of our cities and towns, or what I call the rise of universities. How has this worked? Well, number one, campus expansions also raise housing costs and displace residents in neighborhoods, many times of color, that largely surround campuses. Higher education's broad control over labor can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts, not just for those who work on campus, but for everyone in the surrounding towns and cities. Nonprofit university medical centers emphasize profitable boutique services, high-profile research, or prioritize student services to the detriment of their responsibility to offer indigent care to surrounding residents. And finally, campus police forces surveil and profile the same residents and are rarely held to public account. Even if all schools don't hold all of this power, across the country, we are witnessing greater swaths of our cities being turned into some version of a campus. So the question I ask in the book is, well, how did we get here? Well, after World War II, cities faced the so-called urban crisis of growing Black and Latinx populations alongside white flight to the suburbs. It wasn't easy for schools to follow the money, so a group of urban universities got together and lobbied the federal government for an amendment to the Housing Act of 1949 called the Section 112 Credits Program. This program helped make higher education the friendly face of urban renewal projects all across the country. Some call this project Negro removal, as these efforts demolished Black and brown neighborhoods in campus areas, excuse me. In fact, UC Berkeley used this program to acquire large amounts of acreage immediately south of campus, which triggered the displacement of Black residents who had lived in low-cost housing built for shipyard workers during World War II. Moreover, one of the key plots of land that was purchased during this time was the property that will become People's Park. This land was purchased well below market value and largely targeted for student housing. However, UC Berkeley left large swaths of this land undeveloped or consistently rented out their housing units at above average market rents. So between 1964 and 1970, dormitory usage dropped. Students were pushed into the off-campus housing market, which inflated land values in town and raised housing costs for Berkeley residents. So in this time period, we see housing inflation in the city of Berkeley and the displacement of Black and brown residents who had been living there, especially since World War II. However, by the time we get to the 1990s, we have this moment of history of convergence, of interest convergence. That after years of divestment in cities and towns like Berkeley, so if you look at the south side of Berkeley, that area had been divested. Those lots had been left empty for many decades. But in the 90s, you have the grandchildren of suburban sprawl looking to come back into the city. And you have urban policies of underwriting tech companies and startup labs, and you have an increase in quality of life policing that over-polices the poor and student radicals and longtime residents to make way for a different kind of city. So because cities begin to compete with each other for young professionals and empty nesters who want that back to the city life. We can see this most clearly in cities like San Francisco with the rise of what will become the tech boom. At the same time, universities are trying to compensate for a shrinking state contributions to higher education. So what we have here is we have an interest convergence between cities competing with each other for these returning residents from the suburbs. And you also have schools trying to figure out different ways to generate revenue because the states are contributing less to higher education. They both are figuring out ways to reimagine the cities around the campuses. Why? Because what are empty nesters and young professionals when they have an idea about the city? What is it? Fully wired, walkability, density, coffee shops, lecture halls, libraries, museums. In short, the suburban vision of a city during this back to the city moment was a campus. So in the 90s and 2000s, city leaders and university administrators came together to figure out ways to turn more and larger swaths of the city and the town into some version of a campus. This became the new economy. At the center of this new phenomena was what today we call the knowledge economy. Schools were increasingly enrolling more out-of-state and international students to generate greater revenue than they could by in-state students. They also increasingly use academic research to create profitable commercial goods or patents in a range of fields, from pharmaceutical industries and software products to life science companies and military defense weaponry. It also began to deploy debt financing to build out amenity-rich clusters of high-end housing, retail, and recreation in older neighborhoods to compete for the best students, faculty, and their families. So in short, the campus became a planning mechanism to build out universities by retrofitting neighborhood blocks to maximize wealth extraction based on land control, labor management, and the privatization of governance. So on this image screen here, we have Bakery Square in Pittsburgh and Harper Court in Chicago. Bakery Square is right around UPitt and Carnegie Mellon, and Harper Court is right near UChicago. So these are precisely the knowledge communities that were built precisely in what historically have been neighborhoods of color or poor neighborhoods to recruit students, faculty, and their families and investors back into the cities to power this knowledge economy, this conversion of what had primarily been divested city blocks into campus blocks for the knowledge wealth extraction that was primarily driven by turning these neighborhoods into some version of a campus filled with amenity-rich retail, housing, laboratories, workshops that can meet the needs of students, families, investors, and researchers. So what's the consequence of this for Berkeley? Okay. So administrators talk about the public benefits of increased enrollments. That, again, with more students, we are, in short, increasing the service, the public good service of higher education to meet the needs of public education. But let's be clear, like many schools across the country, UC Berkeley is shifting its focus from in-state students to both out-of-state students and international students who pay higher rates. At the same time, UC Berkeley still only houses about 23% of its students. As a part of this housing, there are a few low income options, and that as students are pushed out into the city of Berkeley's housing market, we are seeing that single families are not able to compete in terms of price points with the rise of things like mini dorms. The cutting up of single family housing into multiple student units where developers and landlords can get more money for the same square footage if they retrofit their homes to meet the needs of full-paying students. So this has a profoundly adverse effect on housing values and housing costs for the city of Berkeley. So again, the so-called public good service of higher education in a town like Berkeley is actually having directly negative impacts on the public good needs of the residents of the host city and the host town of Berkeley, California. At the same time, now expatriates from San Francisco's .com driven housing inflation have also flooded Berkeley because, relatively speaking, even with inflated costs, housing in Berkeley is more affordable than in San Francisco. But this further exacerbates the area's housing crisis for long-term residents. Now, when asked about building out more housing directly on the main campus, we hear talk about, no, we can't do that because we need to preserve the aesthetic beauty of the rolling hills of your grounds. But on the other hand, what do we see being built? We see the increased build out of research laboratories at the heart of campus that have the capacity to generate massive revenues with private pharmaceuticals, tech, and life science partners. So for example, Tolman Hall, that once housed the School of Ed and the School of Psychology, has been torn down, making way for, of all things, a gateway data hub, lucrative revenue generating building. At one time, that building had a library for both schools. Now there is no library. The Li Ka-shing Center for Biomedical and Health Services replaced Warren Hall. Warren Hall was the home to the School of Public Health, and it also had a library. All three of these schools are now in the Berkeley Way West building with no libraries, but there are 2 restaurant spaces and 3 floors of commercial rental space now leased out to Microsoft. Berkeley also plans to demolish Evans Hall on campus and turn it into an open space. Well, why would you turn that into an open space when you have plans to destroy the open space of People's Park off campus and turn that into housing? So the point here is that the preservation of the campus grounds and its aesthetic beauty hold little weight when we look at what is being built on campus, all lucrative for-profit research and development laboratories that will bolster the for-profit interests of the campus. So we must continue to ask, university, higher education, public good for whom? Let's be clear. UC Berkeley is now the largest real estate holder in California, with over $2.5 million in real property, which includes a 39,000 acre reserve system, the largest of its kind in the world. Yeah. Many of these tracts were purchased at below market rate during the urban renewal era, using the public power of eminent domain, while the school provides little housing for low-income students or any kind of property inflation relief for low-income residents. So in light of both unregulated enrollments and housing scarcity, what have been the public good benefits of these massive land acquisitions? In short, Berkeley has used public power to become a private developer with little public oversight. Real quickly, I want to focus your attention to two areas: land and labor. The university's own press materials brag about, quote unquote, employing a private developer mindset. Just a couple of years ago, Berkeley Capital Strategies, the real estate arm of the university, used the donation from a private developer to purchase the 112-year-old rent-controlled apartment building at 1921 Walnut Street. As a state institution, the school was able to override. This is a tricky little end around in the state constitution of California. As a state nonprofit entity, the University of California, Berkeley, has the capacity to override any city's municipal protections for housing. So when they purchased 1921 Walnut, they were able to override the city of Berkeley's rent control protections. And what have they done? They've demolished that, and they're building upscale student housing on that property, taking away more affordable low-income housing from residents in the city of Berkeley in the name of serving the public good of student housing. Mm-hmm. There was an initial proposal to integrate student housing with the apartment complex, but now affordable housing for the city has been replaced with 400 square feet, fully furnished one-bedroom units that start at $4,400 per unit. Oh, but not to worry. While these are furnished for one, they can be rented to three. Marketeers have been quite savvy to pitch this complex, this anchor housing development, as addressing the student housing crisis by targeting commuter students forced to live far from campus and offering scholarships to Pell eligible students. However, there still are no explicitly affordable units here, while the complex has also taken away rent control units from local residents. Like other public and private universities, UC Berkeley has also leveraged the tax exemption of their campus properties to broker profitable development deals for the school and their commercial partners. These transactions generate wealth by passing the financial burden on to property tax-starved city budgets and by exploiting the local low-wage labor market. Just to be clear, these developments, when they sit on campus land, become tax shelters for the private partners that rent out space in these buildings. So for example, the new development, Berkeley Way West here, is a new hybrid academic, quote unquote, speculative office building where private companies like Microsoft can benefit from the low-cost research and development coming from graduate student workers, while also being sheltered from overhead costs with the nonprofit property tax exemptions provided by a state university. Many of these buildings have no cafeterias, or they are staffed by private subcontractors, which allows the university and its private partners to reduce costs by sidestepping powerful California campus labor unions. Mm-hmm. This tactic also helps suppress wages citywide because UC Berkeley is the biggest employer in town, and every other employer must follow suit. So when wealthy homeowners became the face of the controversial CEQA lawsuit, it kind of colored the story as simply being greedy, NIMBY homeowners don't want any development in their backyard. And to be fair, some of those homeowners did feel like that. They didn't want any development in their backyard, and they benefited heavily from the increased property values of their homes by sitting next to California, Berkeley. But that characterization has also obscured this larger story about Berkeley Way West, about 1921 Walnut, about People's Park. This case also reveals the broad implications of the degree to which universities like UC Berkeley has a stronghold over the land and labor in the town of Berkeley, with dire consequences both for low-income students, for low-wage workers, and for long-time residents. Ultimately, there is a crisis facing the college town of Berkeley that is much bigger than the Bay. But just to be clear, there is another way. I turn your attention to the University of Winnipeg in Canada. I was there about 3 years ago, and I discuss at the end of my book. And at that school, another public university, they faced a massive shift in explosion of student population. They went from a 6,000 person commuter campus to a 10,000 person residential college. So very similar to the exponential growth faced at Berkeley. But instead of passing on the housing to the city that surrounded them, they created their own development company and built out housing to serve the needs, not just of students, but also residents. What you have in the background is what's called the Downtown Commons. It has 4 price points: premium rate, market rate, affordable rate, and rent guaranteed income. The only difference is that the premium rates have those balconies, those 13 units that you see on the screen with the balconies, those are premium rate. Every other unit from market to rent guaranteed income are interchangeable. When you move into the building, you can't tell what kind of unit you are moving into unless you have a premium rate home. The premium rate units help underwrite all the other 3 developments. This is a mixture of both residents from the town and students that attend the University of Winnipeg. The common areas have free Wi-Fi so that those who can't afford Wi-Fi in their individual units can have access to Wi-Fi. And because the residents that live in the surrounding neighborhoods around the campus are primarily indigenous, come from indigenous communities, the air ducts in the unit have been retrofitted to make it available for the common areas to be used for indigenous smudging practices. Moreover, the university built out a recreational facility, a new multi-million-dollar recreational facility. That facility is governed by a community charter, which means that during peak hours, neighborhood organizations have direct access to this facility that's governed not by an advisory board, but by a legally binding community charter that they can make an appeal to at any time if the university breaches these agreements. Now, just to be clear, Winnipeg is brick cold about 10 months out of the year. So having indoor common spaces is a high premium in a place like Winnipeg, even more than in a place like Berkeley. But just imagine if your common areas were governed by a community charter. And finally, I'm not sure which company you all have, but every school has a contract with one of these horrible multinationals, Chartwell, Sodexo, Marriott, whichever one you name it, right? High cost, low quality, paying about $14 for a chicken sandwich, and it's horrible. It's a huge hustle. So they fired their contract. They ended their contract with Chartwells, and they created their own food service company called Diversity Foods. On the employment side, about 60% of their employees come from what they call difficult to employ communities, which means First Nations, indigenous folk, single mothers, recently incarcerated, New Canadian, which we would call immigrant communities. So all these communities, they are the primary employees of this Diversity Foods. And they're moving from not just offering equitable wages, but to profit sharing. On the sustainability side of the kitchens, and I walked through these kitchens, 70% of their raw materials come from small local farms from within a 100-kilometer radius of the campus. Every kitchen station has a compost bin next to it, and they take all the cooking oil from this kitchen and send it out to be converted into biodiesel. So these are the kinds of realities that are full within our grasp about ways to reimagine what it means for higher education to actually offer a public good to the communities where they sit and to the low-income students that can barely adjust or afford to be near the campus nowadays. So because of these experiences and because of the work that I've done in my book, I built out a lab called the Smart Cities Lab to begin thinking about the best practices for building out equitable urban communities with a specific focus on higher education-driven development. I get all the time critiques saying, well, you got critiques, or people say, you're academics, you all pie in the sky analysis and critique. What are the solutions? Well, Winnipeg was a perfect example of a different way of doing universities. But in talking to people and in consulting and working with community groups all over the country, I can say there are a number of ways to do higher education differently. So for example, we can think about payments in lieu of taxes. So both public and private schools are tax exempt. Their property is tax exempt. Those taxes go to things like public schools, snow removal, which is an issue for you all, but trash removal, public works, all the taxes that schools don't pay, and they get hoarded on these campuses, especially when these campuses become tax shelters for partnerships with private investors in pharmaceuticals or software or life sciences. That all gets underwritten and extracted from what's not paid out in the public services of the host community. So payments in lieu of taxes becomes a way to begin augmenting that process of extraction. You can also create community benefits agreements. Anywhere that the campus or the university builds in the surrounding neighborhoods could be governed by a community benefits agreement that it can include things like the community charter for common areas in the new buildings. It could include zip code specific job training and job quotas for the surrounding campuses. It could include affordable housing land trust to make the area still affordable. It could include mortgage affordability trust that for long-term residents who are on fixed incomes, when the campus comes and builds up and increases property taxes and land values, a mortgage rate trust would allow them to augment and offset their mortgages and their property taxes so they can still live in the community, even when housing costs go up and property taxes go up. We could talk about community engaged endowments, moving portions of the endowment from a money market account into community serving financial institutions. We could also build out community-based planning and zoning boards so that any development from a university that gets situated within a community must go before a community-based planning and zoning board with legislative and not just advisory power. We can talk about food services. During the pandemic, a couple of schools began to take the food that we throw away every day and began to repackage it into healthy meals for communities in need. Why not all schools doing this all the time? All the time. This is low-hanging fruit, where schools could volunteer to package that food you throw away into healthy meals for communities in need. So the point here is that if schools, and I've been able to work with community groups in Philadelphia, in New Haven, in New York, and throughout my home state of Massachusetts to push forward some of these proposals and visions in real ways. And in the Q&A, we can talk about how we were able to get with community groups, were able to push the city of New Haven to force the University of Yale to offer greater contributions to the host city through an increased pilot. Working right now, we're fighting with UPenn and Drexel to create protections for affordable housing in the West Philadelphia neighborhoods that have been renamed University City. So these are just a couple of things that I'm doing on the ground, taking this research and turning it into policy. Because I argue that if schools are going to offset reduced state spending on higher education with increased enrollments, then they must build enough affordable housing for those students. Public institutions should never be allowed to use eminent domain to hoard land, but especially not in the middle of a housing crisis. When a public university purchases a property, state law should not give the school power to override local housing protections. When for-profit research is conducted on campus land, the property and the profits must be subjected to appropriate taxation. And after years of stewarding, what all agree has been a people's park purchased with the people's tax dollars. The school should not be allowed to swoop in and bulldoze a public serving park and space in the name of student housing, especially when it holds acres of vacant land, both on campus and throughout the town where housing could be built elsewhere. The controversy here reveals an issue much larger than public education. This is a struggle. The struggle over People's Park is just the tip of the iceberg of a struggle between autocratic control and democratic possibility. Right before our eyes, higher education has become one of the main engines driving today's political economy, largely using the language of the public good to consolidate public powers, public dollars, and political power. However, this ivory tower prosperity has not been distributed evenly across the other publics: low-income students, long-term residents, low-wage workers on the campuses. So we must ask ourselves, even if the issue is increasing enrollment, who does it really benefit when we cede such autocratic control to a public university, to any university? And not only what are the costs, but what are the alternatives for building a more humane, more just, more equitable, more democratic university, more in line with the claims of higher education's mission to serving our broader public? Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Baldwin. So we're actually still waiting for our next presenters who are supposed to go after to show up. So if you're okay with it, could we do a few minutes for questions?
Of course.
Cool. So yeah, if you're on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand. If you're in person, you can raise your hand too and come up and ask your question. Or if there's anything you wanted to share, or like bring up or discuss.
Sure. Anybody. I mean, while you're getting your questions together, I'll just say that my vision for higher education and more equitable, really turning the university into a commons for all, it doesn't come out of just my head or out of current struggles. It's rooted in the history of schools like the University of California, San Diego, in your own system. In the 70s, that got together and tried to build out a third college, a Lumumba Zapata College, that would be organized around a third world curriculum and critical analysis of what today we would call globalization. They did that. There were a Merritt College right in Oakland, right in your own backyard in 1968, that they used to, on that campus, serve the North Oakland community, not far from your campus. They used to serve the North Oakland community with public lectures, with free cafeteria food, with trips to Cuba for teach-ins. That Merritt College became the site where that gave rise to the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Malcolm X Community College in Chicago, they created, the students, when they took over that campus, they created a prison annex for incarcerated residents. They fired the off-duty Chicago police and hired a local Black-owned public security force, unarmed, to patrol their campus. So the things that I'm saying, some of them are forward-thinking, but some of them look to the past to recover visions that were student-driven, that were Black and brown community-driven, of a different vision of the community that came. Today we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we've collapsed it to simply just being about curriculum and faculty diversity. But if we go back to the past, diversity, equity, inclusion meant not just faculty and curriculum, it meant making the campus really be placed in service to what at the time were largely Black and brown neighborhoods that surrounded the campus. We need to recover and expand that broader vision, because if your DEI is not serving the communities that surround the campuses or the communities that were displaced from Berkeley, that now all the resident people that work in your cafeterias that they have to commute from, if it's not serving those communities, then the DEI mandates and missions ring hollow. So I would say that. So any questions, any insights, any observations that you might have would be welcome.
Yeah, do you want to come up?
Hello, Dr. Baldwin. My name is Brandon. It wasn't necessarily a question, but when you brought up about the current housing condition of like Berkeley students, how they're like staying in these mini dorms, I don't know, I just felt like super red, because I know so many people that are living exactly in what you described, right? Where it's just one landlord who turns that single family home into like 3 different floors, and like on each floor there's like 7 kids living in there barely trying to make rent. And so that's like really the situation for a lot of Berkeley students. You know, a lot of my friends, a lot of people that I know that went here. And I mean, also there's I don't know if you've heard about how the university isn't trying to renew the lease for one of the biggest co-op, yeah, for Rochdale. And so they're basically having Rochdale in a chokehold by not saying to renew their lease unless they specifically pay for a multi-$100 million seismic retrofitting. Although that they lease the land to the Berkeley Student Cooperative system for like $1 a year.
Right, right. No, thank you for that. And just to add on to what you're saying, so with the way in which the university has worked the housing market, they're exploiting both students and residents at the same time. And while they sit on and sit as the largest real estate holder in the state of California, all in the name of the public good. So this is just criminal. This is criminal. Yeah. And we're all paying the price. And then, you know, you have 9 targeted sites where you're going to build housing, and the first 2 they target are 1921 Walnut Street, a site of affordable housing, and People's Park, a place that serves the needs of the most vulnerable. That if that doesn't tell you the intent and the focus of the university, I don't know what does. So thank you for those comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to come up?
And thank you for confirming that about the mini dorms. I mean, you know, I know about it through anecdote, but to say that you experienced it just adds more fuel and confirmation. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
If anybody wants to share experiences, I mean, do you see what I'm talking about, or does this seem speculative? Does this seem like science fiction, or does this resonate with people in the room or on Zoom with what you see in your surroundings?
Do you want to come up, Kanisha? You don't. Oh, that works too. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, you were talking about pilot as like instead of having to not pay money for some of the programs in the city. So how are ways that we can like obligate the university to do that? Because obviously they are not going to do that locally.
Okay. Could you repeat the question at the mic? I couldn't, because I'm on Zoom. It's hard. It got swallowed up by the room. So could whoever's at the mic, could they repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just asking. So you mentioned pilot programs where the universities are going to be paying money because they're not paying taxes right now.
Right.
And so I was just wondering, what are ways that we can obligate universities to be paying that money?
Yeah.
Because obviously they're not going to want to do so on their own.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So it's tricky because public universities are not nonprofits. They're technically state entities. So it's kind of a parallel phenomena. But what is going on in various states that I'm working with is that they're putting forward legislation. So in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts, they're pushing for different kinds of legislation on the books, pushing on the state charter, that because universities, both public and private, can't exist without the state charter, And the state charter dictates that those entities serve a public mission. So legislators and activists are making appeals to the public charter saying that you're not serving the public good, you're doing more extraction than service. And so, especially if what's going on your campuses is not for educational purposes, it must be adequately taxed. And what we're seeing now in today's knowledge economy that I spoke about earlier is that a lot of what's going on campuses is not for educational purposes. It's like Berkeley Way West, or it's a partnership with a private housing developer, and the money is generated to benefit. So, example, with Anchor House, we know that the donor that gave the money for that gave it in exchange for gaining control over the development after a couple of years. That's a financial arrangement. So a big problem is the laziness or the limited capacity of city and county assessors to properly assess the land use of these campus projects. Sometimes those assessors don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources to do that kind of work. Other times you see a lot of the assessors or the municipal leaders, they graduated from Berkeley. So they have a shared interest and a shared vision around what these buildings should be doing. So there's got to be social movement organizing. There's got to be appeals to local legislatures and state legislatures to, number one, make sure that these properties are being accurately assessed. And number two, to push for some variation on a pilot. I don't agree with or advocate for a full-scale pilot because for me, pilots don't they don't solve the problem. So right now, Yale pays a $14 million pilot, and yet New Haven still struggles. That's the biggest pilot in the country. But what the pilot does is it opens the conversation to say, okay, let's prorate a pilot. So for the degree to which you serve the community, you can pay less taxes. So it becomes a project by project, transparent relationship that's ongoing and consistent versus a one-time a year pilot payment and then the university washes its hands. I'm striving for a sustained, ongoing, transparent relationship that's annual and that's budget-based versus a one-off payment. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. I mean, while people are thinking, the important point here is that right now we have a profound degree of mission misalignment. That the things that schools claim they do is grossly disparate from what they actually do. And so with my work, the first job has been simply to map out the actually existing relationships that universities have to their students and to their communities. And then with that vision of real estate, of healthcare, of policing, of labor, of endowments, of student housing, when we really map this out, then we can hold this story up to the light of the mission claims of higher education and begin to advocate and organize accordingly. All this is hiding in plain sight underneath the myth of higher education as a schoolhouse. When, as one of my good colleagues, Craig Wilder, says after reading my book, he realized that teaching classes has become a side hustle for schools today. So that's what I say.
Yeah. Cool.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just gonna say that recently we had a protest at the UC, and after the protest, my friend sent me a post on Reddit, and I went through the comments, and like all the comments were really like negative about the park and us. And a couple of the comments were saying like, oh, these are just a bunch of NIMBYs that don't want the building on their land because of their property value. And then like, oh, these people that are protesting, they have stocks in like the property around here. And I'm thinking like, sir, I live in a van. But yeah, but then when you were saying that that was actually a narrative, like that was planned, that narrative was pushed, that like had me understanding why so many people thought like that, because I didn't understand it when I first read those.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. And it's a compelling narrative that you look like you're getting in the way of public education.
Mhm.
But when we situate the People's Park and the limited student housing on campus with the profound portfolio of land owned by the university, then that claim just falls apart.
Right,
And when we
right.
look at what the university is doing with this land for profit, it's for-profit investments, that claim is challenged. And so that's why I deliver this speech to you all, these comments to you all today, to arm you with talking points that can respond to that very facile and uninformed observation about you all being NIMBYs with stocks.
Right.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know,
Thank
and
you.
just to add more insult to injury, just to your point, I was talking to people in People's Park, and because California police, University of California police have jurisdiction of the entire state, and UC Berkeley police have a jurisdiction of the entire city, anywhere there's a campus building. And because the campus is expanding throughout the city, if you're given a stay away order, which means I think you can't be from within 100 feet of a campus building,
Yeah.
that means you can't be in downtown Berkeley.
Mhm.
So talk about the privatization of public life in the name
Right.
of serving the public good. It's criminal. And it does away with, it undermines free speech and and it does away with free speech
That
and
actually,
free assembly.
yeah, that actually happened to one of the park residents. They were given a stay away order from all UC campuses and UC like own land. So they basically got a stay away order like away from their own home. And
Right.
like, yeah, he fought that, but it was messed up. It was really messed up.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But it
thank you
just
so
tells
much.
you, it tells you the interests, the investments, and the motivations of the university, all in the name of the public good.
Public good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
One more thing, I just wanted to bring up, one of your slides, had a, like statement on it. It said, smarter cities or the smartest cities are developed without displacement, something like that.
Yeah.
And that just really resonated with me because I feel like one of the like underlying assumptions that so many people have is that in order to develop, you must displace people. And it's not even something I feel that is spoken, but when people talk about development, that is part of their understanding of it. And so I just think it's so important to help people understand that you can develop without displacing people.
Yeah, no, I thank you for that. That is the tagline from my Smart Cities Lab that came out of speaking to community residents all over the country, because some activists, that actually are not in the communities, they're like, we can't develop, we got to do, everything's got to be preserved. But we talk to residents, they're like, listen, we want development. We want the university near us. We want the coffee shops. We want the concert halls. We want the museums, but we want to be able to stay here to enjoy it. We want protections that allow us to make this neighborhood affordable for a mixture of different kinds of people. That really is an urban experience. And so that's where the tagline came from, is that these communities, they want development, but they want protections and policies that do not mean that they can't stay and be there to enjoy it, because they understand that many times the housing, the retail, the amenities that are being brought into these communities are not meant for them. And so we must put policies and projects in place that allow for a mixture of price points and uses and experiences to coexist in these campus neighborhoods, because these residents, they want to be in the neighborhood. They want to see the campus as a commons. It doesn't have to be an either or phenomenon. So thank you for pointing that out.
Right. Anyone else? Last comments? Cool. All
I
right.
just
Well,
want to thank y'all for being here and being interested, and to beginning to develop a vision that hopefully can one day become a mobilization. And if you want to stay in conversation, I'm on Twitter at Davarian Baldwin. You can reach out. My email is davarian.baldwin@trendcall Endowments.edu. Let's build, let's develop a vision. This doesn't have to stop here. This is just the beginning. And you're not alone. There are community groups and student groups all over the country that are right now, especially after the pandemic and the social uprisings that came after the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. People are connecting the dots. And I'm happy that my work is being in service to this revisioning and reimagining of different universities and their communities. So let's continue to think and build. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Baldwin. Thanks for speaking. Definitely powerful stuff and all like useful stuff, which we definitely appreciate. And we would love to stay in touch and work together. Because you know, we all got to come together to build this stuff. But yeah, and also one last thing I want to say, I'm sure we all really appreciate that you did take the time to go to the park when you were out here last time. Because I think a lot of people don't actually take the time to, you know, go out and meet the communities that they're talking about. So yeah, I just think that's important. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good
You
night.
too.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.